Okay, we'll get started. I want to welcome everybody to today's really exciting panel discussion, Climate Change and Migration, Utah's Opportunity to Lead. We're so pleased to have all of you with us today. My name is Josh Kraft and I work for Utah Clean Energy. I serve as our government and corporate relations manager, but we are pleased to help facilitate the Climate and Clean Air Compact, which is brings together an amazing group of leaders from business, government, nonprofit, and faith communities to advance positive solutions and discussion about climate change and clean air solutions. And we attempt to convene at least once a quarter to have conversations around and educational briefings around these topics. And we know that moving forward, one of the challenges we're going to have together is one about immigration and migration around the world. And I'm so pleased to have a number of experts with us to lead us through that discussion and this conversation. Before I introduce our panelists, I just have a few quick logistical notes. First, we will have discussion and chat at the end, and I will encourage everyone to enter questions that you have in the chat. And as time allows, I will allow everyone to unmute themselves and ask questions of our panelists at the end of our discussion. The second item is that we are recording this event so we can share with folks later on. We want to just ask everyone to make sure that during the discussion, you try to keep yourself on mute. You're welcome to keep your video on or keep it or off, but just to mute yourself during the discussion so that we can make sure that that the audio comes through clearly. With that, I wanted to let everyone know that we're going to have a short overview, talk a little bit about Utah's role in leading nationally in this discussion, and then end with the panel discussion among the folks with us today. And I'm so pleased to have three great discussants and panelists. The first who will kick off our discussion is Judy Dorsey. Judy's here. She is the founding president and principal engineer for Brendle Group, a longtime partner of ours. They're an impact-driven sustainability consulting and engineering firm. I can't summarize all the many different types of projects that Judy's worked on in this field, including to help found some of our initiatives like the Utah Climate Action Network. But in addition to all the work that she's done in the sustainability field, Judy is also took a 6-month sabbatical in 2019 to study the relationship between global migration, social justice, race, poverty, resettlement. And we're so pleased to have you with us, Judy. Our second panelist is Dr. Raissa Uddin. Dr. Uddin is a pediatric physician who received her medical degree from Florida International University's Wertheim College of Medicine in Miami and completed her residency at Emory University in Atlanta. And she has been studying the intersection of climate and pediatric health, particularly during that residency period. And recently, she has joined as a fellow at the University of Utah's Global Rural and Underserved Child Health Program. And we're so pleased to have her with us today. And then finally, I'm not last but not least, Anicet. Can you just ask everyone to make sure you're on mute? Thank you. Anicet Adjahossou, who is a senior reintegration officer and sustainable settlement planner with over 15 years of experience with the United Nations Refugee Agency. He also has does this work with Brendle Group, and he's been working at the vital intersection of systems engineering and sustainability and humanitarian settlement. So welcome, Anicet. Thank you. And with that, I just want to say that Utah Clean Energy comes at this discussion as someone who helped pull together the Utah Climate and Clean Air Compact, and the focused on climate, air quality, and energy. and those topics might not seem closely related to migration and climate at first blush. But I want to say that both of these topics, migration, immigration, climate, and clean air, have roots and support among leaders here in our state, in our community. The picture on the left here is the founding of the launch of the Compact on Immigration in 2010, which was a statement about the need for a practical, but also compassionate and sustainable response to immigration issues in our country, and which we drew upon when we launched the Climate and Clean Air Compact. And to me, there's a number of parallels here, and the first is that an understanding that that these are rooted in Utah values of, again, a conservative but compassionate response to the challenges that face us. They're ones that have broad support and engagement from business, faith, and community leaders. They're ones in both immigration and climate can be divisive and challenging issues at a national level, but ones that also and require responses and shaping from the ground up, and also ones where we've put out principles to guide policy. We are not a policy-making group or a coalition, but ones that, but each has been one where Utah has led and tried to put out statements that can inform how we respond, and not only as a state, but as a nation. And I'll just end by saying that we're always so moved at Utah Clean Energy by the leadership that this state has taken in understanding around issues of resettlement and migration, and that understanding that you can be displaced from your home, and that is a jarring experience and one that requires understanding and compassion, but also opportunity. And I think that looking at these trends and how they come together will both provides the need to understand that folks will be displaced and the new realities that come with that, but also the opportunities that can create for us to, as a state, but also as a community, to have as new people come here and our communities change and grow. With that, I want to hand it over to Judy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Josh, for that introduction. We always appreciate our collaborations with Utah Clean Energy and the great state of Utah, with the values that you just described and their intersection with both humanitarian, compassionate approaches to immigration as well as climate. So my job is to provide a very brief introduction to the current state of practice, if you will, at this intersection between climate change and migration. So then we can then have a nice discussion with our panelists and then open it up for all of you. So thank you all for coming today. If I were to provide this overview in just 3 succinct points, is that people move. That has been happening before climate change. It's been happening since the dawn of time. People move. However, climate change increases that movement, and therefore planning plays a significant role. So I'd just like to highlight a little bit about each of these 3 points. The first one around people moving is on the next slide. We see that actually this hasn't changed much in our country over time, that roughly 10% of our population in the US moves every year. That hasn't changed so much. And so when you think about that, already there are these forces for movement independent of climate change. Utah not only is no exception, it's the leader of the pack. If you look at the census data over the last decade, Utah's population increased at a rate of 17.6%, making it the highest rate of any state in the nation. Yesterday, I heard news coverage about this, that it's not just Utah, but very close on your heels are your neighbors in Idaho and also Colorado. So it's kind of an American West thing as well. The most important thing to keep in mind about climate migration, just like in climate resilience, we're talking about disproportionate impacts between those that are contributing to climate change and those that are feeling the greatest effect. People moving changes demographics. So Utah, for example, the trend of increasing diversity is projected to continue, which estimates the minority population will grow from our current levels at 20% of the state's population in 2015 up to 35% by 2065. So picture As this population increases in Utah, the demographics changing as well, to the tune of, right now it's estimated that about 1 in 11 Utahns were born in another country, and about the same number have at least one immigrant parent. So now you can start to see some of this intersection we've been trying to describe. So in the next slide, we're moving to our second pillar that, yep, people move, climate change exacerbates that. These are just a few of the points to support that. There's a whole body of information surrounding migration demographics broadly on a national and mostly on an international scale. But I just wanted to highlight some points closer to home. Honestly, this picture was taken from my cell phone last year, trying to figure out tourism and travel in summer. And I'm sure many of you are already experiencing that. Where are you going? When are you planning your trips surrounding wildfire or other hazards? But broadly speaking, it's just not wildfire smoke, but it's heat. We just finished the climate resilience plan for Kansas City with an equity lens, and the forecast around high heat and the human impacts. I'm sure we'll hear this from Raissa, especially with her intersection with pediatric health. These are very serious health concerns. So you can see that people are more likely to move in extreme heat and other climate change impacts. If we were to go to the next slide, the question, as Josh mentioned, I took a sabbatical and I wanted to start to put this in perspective. Broadly speaking, climate migration is considered one of the biggest threats to sustainability and a growing humanitarian crisis. And we've seen this in the media and research. It's just that there's just less information about what to do about it because it's relatively nascent. Part of what I wanted to start to do is put some comparisons to, well, what has history taught us about migration and what can we learn and how do we prepare in the United States? So you can see this bar chart we had the Dust Bowl lasted about a decade and displaced around 2.5 million people. And then it goes up from there to the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South, about a 50-year, so 2-generation phenomena, 6 million people. We're expecting now over these next 30 years, so out to 2050, on the order of 12 to 14 million people domestically within the US migrating. And then you can see on an international scale, that's much, much larger. The main thing that I would like to highlight here then is where we start to get into that disproportionate impacts and also a moral imperative, even with internal displacement in the US, because our track record wasn't great with the Great Migration of the African Americans out of the South, with a history of racism in our land use planning, from redlining to access to banking, jobs, et cetera. And as these climate hazards are increasing, it's really unsettling news that recent research is finding that immigrant workers and other vulnerable groups are the backbone to clean up after climate disasters. And so we're calling for the growing resilience industry to be mindful of potential exploitation based on race, even in how we address cleanup from climate hazards. So these things are very intertwined, not just demographic change, but who is moving and why, and what are the drivers for those change and what are our culpabilities there. So because of this big disparity in this right bar of 200 million people and the purple bar, mostly in the US, if we go to the next slide, the dialogue has been around internal displacement due to climate change, rising sea levels, increased storms, et cetera. And so wanted to expand that conversation to more of an international perspective and what can US cities do. So again, this is just to sort of tee up the conversation. I will put it in the chat. If you are interested in the white paper, I put a link to that in the chat. And really, we wanted to look at it from these 8 questions to help US cities prepare. Again, one of the main takeaways from that study is that each country or community's economic burden from climate change is not proportional to their contribution to climate change. Which brings us to the next slide and starting to look at what's this relationship between climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and climate migration, because climate migration can be, if well planned, a form of climate adaptation, for example. But broadly, I don't want to leave an impression that we doomsday, climate change is here. We are working on resilience. People are going to move. We're going to shift only to this paradigm around resilience because it's very, very imperative that we still keep our focus on both mitigation and resilience. And the reason is, if every country meets their climate goals, we will maybe get to that 2 degrees Celsius rise versus 1.5. And the climate scientists understand what that means. But for us lay people, if you look at the research in climate vulnerability and migration, we're talking hundreds of millions of lives impact and lost from the balance in our ability to achieve these mitigation goals. So we absolutely have to keep the focus on mitigation while preparing for the climate resilience, both existing community members and then now new community members from climate migration. And the narrative still out on climate migration. It's going to be an outcome of climate change. How we respond determines our resilient and equitable and humanitarian response versus some other potential negative responses around increased militarization or other things. So anyway, just wanted to make sure we understand that, that these all three are very, very interrelated, are and important to prevent climate change, prepare for it, and protect people throughout that process, especially people being displaced from disproportionate impacts. So back to the third pillar, and then I'll wrap it up pretty quickly here to get to this discussion, is that planning is super important on all of this. There are some citations here, and I don't think I need to explain too much, but I will say in the next slide that last August, this was the cover of Planning Magazine, where, excuse me, not the cover, but they were highlighting the top 7 trends for urban planners nationally to be thinking about last August. And one of those 7 trends was around planning for large-scale climate migration, and to really be focusing on more resilience in receiver cities. So some of the research that I just cited in the prior slide starts to tease out different typologies of cities based on forecasts for climate as well as forecasts for migration. And so the next slide starts to highlight how to think about your cities and your communities. And that's whether you're a recipient community, like we said, Utah is growing, and whether you're a vulnerable community, are there places that people will be leaving? And some of this is at different scales, of course. You might see micro trends of movement of people out of urban areas with higher air quality issues in Utah up to higher elevations where they might have cooler temperatures or relief from air quality, for example, to more broad, large scale migration. So the typologies is a sort of starting to shape from the impacts to the potential responses. And I wanted to highlight, these recipient communities, which might be what we're talking about in Utah, is that, it doesn't discount the fact that there are all other stressors that might limit growth from water supply or other things. And so the idea is to be planning for a resilient future for both existing and new residents into communities, whereas some communities might be considered climate destinations because they have high vacancy and infrastructure capacity and a desire to grow. So for example, in the next slide, some university researchers are looking into this and actually working with cities such as Duluth, Minnesota, and Buffalo, New York, that are considering revitalizing and branding their communities to become climate havens. So, legacy cities where there might be infrastructure or freshwater supply if they're on Great Lakes, et cetera. And so if anybody's interested, we can dive into that during panel discussion and share more there. So again, looking at the clock, I have just a few minutes to kind of shift then or continue on like what does planning look like for receiving communities? And then the next slide, I wanted just to highlight, it looks like a continuous improvement over how planning is currently done. So I want to emphasize there are a lot of things happening in communities around community planning, resilience, economic health, growth, et cetera. And it's looking at these resources on the right side, but infusing now a lens of climate migration, whether that's expanding and accelerating emissions mitigation efforts like we earlier described, thinking about maybe an equity ratio of principles in our greenhouse gas accounting, considering climate migration typologies in our scenario planning. Those are just some examples. But planners can't do it alone. And then the next slide, we also talk about community engagement. And that could look like anything from surveying your communities, really exploring how immigrants and including climate migrants are supporting your values and goals and can be a part of the solution to climate resiliency, study groups, etc. And then, of course, it's not just community engagement, but forms of collaboration in the next slide, where we explain there are resources out there to help and support this. There's the Mayor's Migration Council, which is an international council with U.S. Participants to be continuing to study these topics and support cities in their planning for climate migration, build and leverage different networks between cities, partner with your philanthropic and faith-based communities, etc. I mentioned as I kind of shift the conversation to the next slide, I mentioned the importance of understanding demographic change, not just population growth. And I'll just say, as a practitioner in sustainability these last 25 years, my relationship and understanding of growth has changed a lot. And even last week at Mountain Towns 2030, which was co-founded by Park City in Utah, there was a good, healthy discussion about what's this relationship between climate mitigation, resiliency, and growth, especially when it comes to climate migration and principles of equity. And so I wanted to say that there are some that are starting to put some rough framing and numbers to that around what would it take for the United States, for example, to be a leading country in welcoming communities. Like, what kind of growth rate, how would we accommodate that on a national level? So if you're interested in discussion, we can share some of those resources. But some are advocating from within sustainability groups for growth rates between 1.8 and 2.2%. And we know that that'll also change demographics. So that will require a kind of a massive sort of civil society response. And in fact, the picture from the opening slide that Josh had was from when Salt Lake City hosted the UN Civil Society Conference. And we, think about like civil society response. And that's why I also think Utah could really be a leader here. So, there are many benefits, as you can see here, from forward thinking and inclusivity, equity response, humanitarian response that helps your community around revitalization and economic development. When you think about Salt Lake City, even many community leaders are credit immigrants for revitalizing some neighborhoods and injecting new energy and life into the town, resettling more than 11,500 refugees since 1994. There's a lot of interesting evidence of revitalization and support and just great things happening in Salt Lake City, for example. And I'm citing this from New Roots in Salt Lake City article from 2019 in partnership with International Rescue Committee. So you are a leader as a state with these values and principles. Welcoming America is a valuable resource. I'm just showing this as an example of their network. And in the next slide, what their standards are to join their network around leadership, civic engagement, being educated on what drives immigration, migration, especially the intersection with climate change, economic development, keeping communities safe as they're changing and growing and evolving demographically, and providing equitable access. Those are the standards. Welcoming America, just as an example, then has various tools to support those standards, such as in the next slide, these things I just will say, don't always think about, depending on our own implicit biases and our own journey with racism, that as climate resilience gets more and more important, are we being mindful of inclusive emergency management? And also brought up the point around emergency response and cleanup. The next slide is another dedicated toolkit to the topic of building your economy by supporting immigrant entrepreneurs. And then finally, the third is an example is really how to harness the volunteer network to that whole civic society response to support these things. So with that, I would like to open up a panel discussion. I do see that we also have some comments coming in. So thank you for those, and we'll be sure we weave those comments such as, broadly world population growth and resource scarcity, and how does that feed into, that's a bit of what I mean by like, what is each of our relationship with the growth mindset broadly. These are challenging topics that I think help really call upon us to think through that relationship between population growth from a macro and more localized level. So with that, I thought what we would do, you heard the introduction from Josh of Dr. Uddin and Anicet, and I thought maybe in their own words, we could have them introduce themselves a little bit more, where you could maybe share, I kind of know some of your personal journey, but I think the audience would be just fascinated. Perhaps we start with Dr. Uddin, and then we go to Anicet. If you could maybe introduce yourself a little bit more on your kind of like intersection of your personal and professional journey on this topic of climate migration, and anything else that we should know about you relative to this topic before we dive into some more discussion.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for joining this very important conversation. Thanks, Judy, for the introductory presentation. That was really great. So Josh has already introduced me. I'm a pediatrician, and I'm also an immigrant. I moved here. I was born and raised initially in Bangladesh, and moved to South Florida around the age of 9. I did complete my education primarily in Miami, Florida, and then moved to Atlanta, Georgia, as described before, for my residency training. I became knowledgeable about climate change serving as an increasingly important threat to global child health during my residency training, but I took a personal interest in it because both places I considered home, including Bangladesh and South Florida, are uniquely exposed to the downstream effects of climate change, such as rising sea levels and coastal flooding. And I'm actually in South Florida right now, and we're getting a very heavy rain constantly because of the approaching hurricane. So it's pretty relevant to my personal life. After residency training, I joined the University of Utah's Global Rural and Underserved Child Health Fellowship. And through that last year, I was actually able to spend some time working clinically in Chinle, Arizona on the Navajo Nation. And that was where I was exposed to some drastically different regional weather variations, as well as, dust storms, things I wasn't exposed to growing up in South Florida. And I really got to see how those types of weather variations had health impacts on children. Just as an example, it's very windy there, and there's very sparse vegetation. So when it gets really windy and dusty, it impacts how many children and adults have allergic and respiratory conditions and present for those concerns. It impacts obesity rates because it impacts whether children are able to play outside. So it just really got me thinking about the clinical effects of climate change that are localized to each region. And then this current academic year, I'm getting to work with Columbia University's Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education, which is a forum to develop resources and content to help educate and empower healthcare professionals and students. So through that, I'm actually getting to explore the nexus between climate change, health, and migration a little bit more, which is partly the reason why I'm here today.
Wonderful. We're going to pick up on some of those threads for sure in our further discussion, but let's hear from Anicet about your background so that we can inform the audience and go from there.
Thank you, Judy, moderator. Let me begin by expressing my thanks to the organizer of this important event, which actually focuses on climate migration, one of the most pressing challenges all countries in the world are facing. Let me dig a little bit deeper to answer the question you raised. My name is Anicet Adjahossou, as just as introduced, and I worked for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which is a global organization dedicated to saving lives, protecting rights, and building a better future for refugees, including climate migrants. After nearly 15 years of professional experience in more than, let's say, 30 humanitarian operations around the world, mostly in underdeveloped and fragile countries, I have been truly immersed in the depth of the environmental crisis and the disruptions caused by climate change in the lives of millions of families who suddenly have to flee their place of origin, often for unknown destinations. So climate change had a huge impact on my professional work, as well as the lives of millions of forcibly uprooted people around the world. In fact, in the refugee settings, many of refugees rely on environment for survival, particularly during emergency, whether for food, for shelter, for fire, medicine, agriculture, income generating activities, and more. Therefore, a sustainable use of natural resources leads to environmental degradation, which lastly impacts on natural resources and on the well-being of the displaced and host communities. Additionally, competition over scarce natural resources such as firewood, land, or grazing land also leads to friction. For example, when we look at the projection on climate change and induced migration in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel region, Africa, where I have been working mainly for the last 10 years, the situation is leading to widespread food insecurity and the significant displacement within the region, where the majority of the population relies on the subsistence farming, herding, and high levels of population growth, together with the depleting resource base, contributes to turning migration from choice to necessity. So in a pessimistic scenario, as per the United Nations estimates, more than 85 million people could have to move internally in the sub-Sahara because of climate change in the next coming years to come. So the Sahel region, as an example, is hosting the highest number of these refugees, including climate asylum seekers, where millions of them have been internally displaced to both ongoing conflict, of course, but also because of prevailing droughts. So in these regions, grappling with the influence of climate-induced people, humanitarian crises are added to pre-existing challenges such as fragile state institutions, ethnic tensions, competition for natural resources such as grazing land or water. And these regions are actually the hotspots for a very complex interaction of factors, and are therefore considered high-risk region for climate impact on human security. So on top of that, I would like to mention that marginalized groups, such as ethnic minorities, especially those living in nomadic or semi-nomadic life, are considered particularly vulnerable in the face of climate extremes, and therefore most at risk. Furthermore, let's say displacement is particularly problematic for these groups, as they are often unable to integrate into the urban network or urban population, and to find a local labor market. So discrimination against ethnic minorities is prevalent, and the language barriers also further complicate efforts to seek employment. So with no formal market skill sets, many climate migrants end up unemployed and in poverty on the outskirts of urban centers. Women and children are most at risk with the widespread experiences of sexual and gender-based violence. So for a lack of better options, migration in these cases are a means of survival rather than an effective climate adaptation strategy. And it is in these conditions that in recent years, calls have been made to advocate for the, to welcome and integrate a climate migrant when it is necessary, but also the adoption of holistic, climate responses, and for example, for the Sahel region in the vein of the humanitarian and development nexus. Thank you, Mr.
Wow, thanks for that introduction. It's a lot to take in, and something that you said struck me, and that was about sort of the pessimistic outlook, and you've kind of painted that this is leading to internal displacements and therefore urbanization, and that it's really a survival strategy versus an adaptation strategy. And it makes me think of healthcare. So Raissa, I'm going to kind of shift, but I recently read, for example, that the top 7 emitting countries in the world spend twice as much on border security than they do on climate action. And that ratio is even higher for the US, as you might, that would probably not be too surprising to hear. And it kind of reminds me like preventative medicine versus treating a condition that, a medical condition. And so, and especially when it comes to like pediatric health, can you kind of speak to your research that you're going to be, and, some of your broad research, and then specifically around pediatric health and migration, and how you're sort of thinking about, how do you think about it from sort of a preventative, like adaptive strategy and proactive ways to be protecting people versus, oh man, we are in the trenches right now and need to be addressing these health crises. Any insights on, if you're following my analogy at all?
Yeah, no, that was a great analogy. I was thinking about that as well. I think one thing in terms of, Anicet, you mentioned that there's a pretty pessimistic outlook, but I actually just read an article that's recently been published in a journal about how hope is such an important part of addressing climate change. A lot of the narratives, I think, can be pretty scary, especially when it comes to migration. I really like the slide that you had, Judy, on providing a historical perspective on migration, because the fact is that human mobility has been a response to climate-related effects for as long as we know, since ancient civilizations. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be framed in certain geopolitical narratives as a bad thing or as a security threat, but rather, and it's not good nor bad. I think it's really just a fact of life, and it's a place for opportunity. I think migration is already a pretty complex topic, but climate-related migration itself is very nuanced, and there's a lot of different push and pull factors. So I think when we look at the estimates of how many migrants would move secondary to climate reasons specifically, I think the numbers can seem really daunting, but we also have to look at populations that are going to be able to adapt in place, first of all, because we are coming up with new technology and new, like, this is kind of part of the conversation, right? To come up, to plan and figure out ways that people can adapt in place, one, and then just paying attention to the fact that those who are able to migrate out from like a regional area to an international location is a very specific subset of population. So I think it's important to consider all of those factors. In terms of looking at this from a health standpoint, I think it's important to note that climate change is really, it's a global health threat. So it's going to affect all of us, albeit differently. So I think it's important to have that humanistic approach, especially when it comes to child health. I'm not going to go into like a lot of detail about the health impacts, but I do want to touch on it because I don't think it's talked about as much outside of the healthcare sphere. So just to think of it, let's think of it even within the US. There's been a lot of, there's been an increased frequency of and strength of extreme weather events, even within the US secondary to climate change. So if we look at the recent wildfire seasons in the West, they've been happening much earlier, they've been more prolonged, and they've had like much significant spread of their impact, right? And so it has been shown that wildfires release particulate matter into the air, which then affects air quality. And how does air quality impact kids specifically? So kids have various developmental stages and their lungs aren't fully mature when they're young. So as they're maturing, their lung pathways, I guess, are smaller than adults. And so particulate matter can actually lodge and stay stuck in their lungs much more easily than it does in adults, which can increase the predisposition to having respiratory illnesses and asthma exacerbations, for example. There's also been a lot of research done in the US, secondary to wildfires, showing that a lot of children who have been exposed to such extreme weather events or even have had to leave their homes have higher prevalence of certain mental health diseases such as anxiety, PTSD, and depression. So it's something we're already seeing in the US community. And then when you look at migrants specifically, it's like I was saying before, it's a very specific subset of people who are actually able to leave not only where they're from, but their regions and migrate nationally. And they have health impacts that can serve as a push factor for migration. So for example, food insecurity and malnourishment can serve as a push factor for migration, but then they also have specific health impacts that they face when they migrate. A lot of times migrants are vulnerable to certain healthcare challenges. So they may not be able to access healthcare properly. They often have irregular immigration status or refugee status, which can affect their employment circumstances and can hence affect their eligibility for employer coverage. So they may not be able to afford certain healthcare costs. Certain routine screenings, which are part of US guidelines, might be missed by a lot of these refugees. It's been shown that certain groups of migrant refugee women have low rates of routine screenings, such as mammographies and pap smears. For children, certain healthcare things that we take for granted, such as our wellness screenings that we do pretty often, get missed in these migrant populations. So there's really, it's very, very nuanced, and I could talk about it forever, but I think Utah is in a really great place to address this because there was a report published in 2021 that actually suggested that Utah had the second best healthcare system in the US. So I think in that sense, like Utah is prepared and can do further planning in how to at least take care of these refugees from a healthcare standpoint. And I think from an economic standpoint, there's an impetus for us to further strengthen the healthcare industry as well in Utah, because that could be kind of a way to economically boost what Utah is already doing. And, in terms of the benefits you were discussing, Judy, I think there's a lot of opportunity.
That's perfect. I thought that would be a great way to sort of finish up this discussion before we open up for the group, which is what are the opportunities for Utah? And when you were speaking, I was thinking it's so helpful to hear from you as an expert on the specific intersection of pediatric health and climate change. And in Utah, I would say, because we work nationally at Brendle Group, Utah has a strength because it was one of the first communities that really illuminated the public health intersection with climate change and the leadership from the public health sector. So, and that you then acknowledge that, you know, there are tops in health care more broadly. I think that's something to keep leaning into for Utah. And it's great that you even brought that a step further with this intersection with migration impacts of the health impacts of staying and then the health impacts of migrating on children. So I guess, and thank you also for your comments about hope and mobility happens, so to speak. And so then how do you find the opportunity in that? And so I guess, Anicet, before we open it up for the group, you know, you've been working in refugee resettlement, mostly in the global South, but with similar framing that could be helpful for Utah, such as your work with UN Habitat and UNHCR on integrated social sustainable development, where you're trying to improve the livelihoods of the host residents, as well as the health and safety of migrants, where you are seeing really big numbers and fast numbers in demographic change. So can you speak maybe even like to the Clovier example or other examples that might provide some insights to how Utah might think about that, you know, the question in the chat about urbanization and like doing it less, as you said, as survival, but like, what does that adaptation strategy look like with you being a foremost sort of practitioner in sustainable resettlements and integrated resettlements with existing urban areas?
Okay, thank you very much, Judy. Yeah, in fact, Kalobeye settlement in Kenya, which was, a plan to, it was mostly planned to accommodate conflict-related refugees than climate, induced displaced. However, we have Kalobeye settlement has received a few refugees from South Sudan because of environmental degradation. But in fact, it is sure that planning plays an important role in this phenomena. And I think the issue of relationship to mitigation and adaptation seems to me to be particularly essential, as it is quite difficult or impossible to completely protect from the consequences of climate change in our communities. So it is often said that climate and environment have no borders, and the effects in one country, however remote, can have a negative impact in other places in the world. And this call for climate adaptation, regulation, resiliency strategy to better respond to climate change. But on a global perspective, from my experience in working with UN Habitat and United Nations, I know UN is making efforts to help the organization achieve its protection mandate by addressing environmental hazards, which are treating refugees and the climate migrant and the host community. So there has been a need for the UN and the host countries to understand and address this global issue, the local environmental hazards faced by the refugees and climate migrants, to develop adaptive programs, trying to apply cutting-edge technologies in displaced settings. But I think we should work, as UNHCR has been doing in the recent years, to work towards meeting these UN-wide environment commitments, such as the UN climate neutral strategy, which requires that organizations to become carbon neutral and to support the sustainable development goals, which are fundamentally underpinned by sound climate, environment management.
Great. So I'm hearing you say a lot of what might be familiar to Utahns around integrated resiliency planning, but broadening to a more global perspective and employing some of these UN development goals. And here again, that could be an area of strength for Utah for some of its history around, global viewpoints, as Josh had pointed out, this intersection with the Immigration Compact. Well, with that, that was a really interesting discussion. Thank you both. And I would love to hear from our audience to see if there are any questions or that you have on your mind to continue this discussion in our remaining time.
I will, I'm going to take the introducer's privilege just to ask you all briefly, and that includes you, Judy. Just thinking about folks, it's not always visible to see the linkages between migration and climate, and I think it's much easier for folks to look at folks who are different from what they're used to and they're accustomed to, and more so than folks like me who moved from Pennsylvania to Boston, Pennsylvania to Utah, maybe. But just to say, quickly, how do you think a good way for us to have conversations with our leaders in our communities about these linkages in a way that people will resonate with them and understand between climate and movement around the world?
I'll take the first crack if anybody wants to add to it, but I think this webinar today during Utah Climate Week is an example. Like, let's just have the conversation and convene people, record it, make it available for others. Some of it starts with knowledge sharing, and that's the feedback we've been getting as we've been working in other communities and hosting discussion groups. Is bring in the experts like the pediatric health global perspective that we're fortunate to have today, or the international development perspective, and start the conversation. I will also mention that we have a toolkit for U.S. cities that will be coming out in partnership with Welcoming America on climate migration, and that will be in 2023. And it's sort of like a beginner, intermediate, advanced, and that beginner really is starting those conversations, identifying partners in your community that have aligned goals and values, starting to build up from there around, other ways that you're looking at your planning landscape, et cetera. But it starts with the conversations and sharing of information and perspectives and lived experiences.
Thank you, Judy.
Yeah, maybe to add a few words. It is, as said by Judy, it is a fundamental that the cities plan for climate migration. It is important to develop a preparedness plan and to incorporate climate change aspect in policy and normative development as well. It's also important to establish partnership. Partnership is a very important partnership with private sector, community-based organization, even also with climate migration research centers, to provide a kind of a better coordinated multi-sectorial responses, so that a climate migrant and their host can benefit from all those services can be provided to thrive together. This partnership and collaboration is very key.
Thank you, Anicet.
I also think it's important to consider the different skill sets that migrants and refugees bring. I think when you're from a different place, you are used to adapting to a certain environment, to certain conditions. And so I think that skill set can be really useful, whether it's in Utah or elsewhere in the US, elsewhere in the world. Just having that like novel outlook can help to spur development and innovation, which I think can be really useful. I also think that people who come from areas with limited opportunities can often be very motivated when they are in an environment that has more opportunity to create good in the world. So I think it's really about like looking at the different types of skill set people offer. So that's one thing. And then I did want to address a little bit of the question in the chat from Ms. Fleming, but I do hear your concern about needing more green zones without apartments and houses and buildings. And I think the opportunity here is that if we do plan ahead of time, if there's more planning involved in terms of city development and relocation strategies, people don't have to necessarily go to an already crowded area like Salt Lake City, for example. Me not being from Utah, I'm only really familiar with Park City and Salt Lake City because those are resort locations, ski resorts and whatnot. But I think there's an opportunity here to bring vibrancy and revitalize communities that are not so well known in a way that is really climate forward and is very environmentally conscious. So I think it's really just a matter of planning and effective adaptation rather than having a goal of keeping people out per se.
That's a great comment. And I know we have just 2 minutes left, so if I could, I think what the overarching theme that really sticks with me from what you just said there is that, and Anicet, we've talked about this at length, we can't just be thinking about climate migrants as burdens on our system. These are people with talents and assets and such knowledge and experience to share. So I'll put in the chat an example. When I was doing my sabbatical, I just was informational interviews as best I could, getting the landscape, meeting people. And this is the state of Idaho has different immigrant and refugee resettlement structures. And this was a woman who started Global Talent Idaho, where it's really looking at studying the talent of immigrants and refugees and putting that to the best and highest work of their full potentials, where people are immigrating. We can't make assumptions about what's displacing people and their educational background, talent, skills, and things that they would contribute in their new community. So I think that's sort of the hope and the positive note that I think our panelists have been bringing to us today is when we think of humanitarian response, a humanitarian response is to embrace the full potential of every individual. And I just think there's a lot of opportunity in that as we proceed in this journey around intersection of climate and migration. Well, I wanted to close by passing it back to Josh and thanking you so much for hosting us, and especially to Anicet and Raissa for sharing your experience. Now, I learn every time I speak with the two of you, I learn more, and it really rounds out my understanding. So thank you both for sharing your experiences and knowledge with us today.
And I want to thank all of you, Judy, Raissa, Anicet, for sharing what you know and for bringing this topic as part of Utah Climate Week to our attention, and also it's a deep topic, and one I think that if I can end by getting back to where Utah can position ourselves in this conversation, where we need to think as part of the Climate Clear Compact about how we work together. It's that there will be some discomfort here with the understanding that there's change, but I think that this state and our community understands that folks have to move and will continue to have to move, and that is not only, that may create some friction and some discomfort in the near term, but it also creates so many opportunities for us to work together and understand that as our world changes, we're strengthened by having understanding that climate can bring us closer together, and the solutions and the responses can bring us closer together. And I'll look forward to sharing all the amazing resources and knowledge that you put together today with more of our leaders as well, and finding some time to continue this conversation in the future. So thank you all, and thank you all for attending today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.